My name is Dr. Mara Ellington. I am 41 years old, and at this precise moment, I find myself sitting by myself in the last row of the ceremonial courtroom inside the Francis K. Lowell Federal Courthouse in Philadelphia. The sound of my heels echoed softly off the marble floor. When I chose my seat, I noticed that no spot had been set aside for me. That suited me just fine. It wasn't as if anyone thought I would actually attend. Toward the front, near the area where the judge presides, my family sits together, displaying crisp suits, pearl earrings, and perfectly upright posture. My younger brother Carter stands next to our father, moments away from taking his oath for the Pennsylvania bar. He is the brand new lawyer, following exactly in our father's path. He's always been the golden child, the sibling who met every expectation. A few rows in front of me, I catch my mother murmuring to someone. She says she's just thankful that at least one of her children figured things out. And then there's my father, Arthur Ellington, a former state prosecutor, who still manages to make every statement sound like a piece of evidence. He is asked to deliver a brief toast before the ceremony, but he avoids meeting my eyes. He lifts his glass and declares, "Justice isn't only understanding the law, it's respecting it in practice." We take pride that at least one of our children never turned away from that responsibility. After all these years, I don't react. You figure out how to accept things without flinching. They believe I left Danford College of Law in disgrace, unable to manage the demands, that I buckled under pressure. What they remain unaware of, what they were never permitted to learn, is that as soon as I stepped away, I was being brought into one of the most secretive divisions of the Federal Bureau of Legal Integrity. At present, I oversee investigations into corruption at the federal level. Judges, senators, and even former federal prosecutors. My credentials grant me access to restricted offices in Atlanta. I've played a part in breaking up bribery networks inside courthouse halls. It's my responsibility to detect decay where others revere legacy. And the case I am on right now concerns someone who is seated only a few steps away from my relatives. Still, none of that holds any weight this afternoon. Right now, I occupy the space of the unnoticed observer, the faded sister. I'm the letdown they reference with strange smiles and abrupt shifts in conversation. Officiating at my brother Carter's ceremony is Judge Robert Malcolm. To my family, Robert is a longtime companion, his stories echoing from dinner parties and memories of shared games of golf. To me, though, Robert is at the center of an ongoing inquiry. Unreported foreign accounts, illegal contributions to campaigns, unacknowledged personal interests, all of it clear by the way he tenses up when our eyes meet. He remembers exactly who I am. I drop my eyes, allowing my family to savor the moment, letting them cling to the belief that I'm simply the quiet one who fell behind. At least for now, I once wandered the corridors of Danford College of Law with such purpose that Professor Darian Holt would sometimes break off mid-lecture just to watch me pass. First-year contracts, constitutional law, criminal law, I devoured every procedure that was introduced. I threw myself into my studies, always eager to participate first, and lingering long after group sessions ended, while others would murmur about me whenever the test results were posted. I attracted attention for my interest in early clerkships, consistently ranking in the top 5% of my class, and even received a faculty recommendation for a leadership position in the Constitutional Advocates Guild. I rarely drank, and wasn't interested in dating. I was determined to follow a clear path. If I managed to stay focused and avoided any distractions, I believed I could climb all the way up, possibly to a position at the federal prosecutor's office, or maybe even achieve a judgeship someday. That's when Professor Darian Holt entered the picture, someone who still provokes an anxious twist in my stomach. He had an impeccable reputation, renowned and seemingly beyond reproach. But he was also quietly known for helping select students progress more quickly through obscure mentoring arrangements. Most people chose to turn a blind eye. Yet, When I stumbled on a printed memo misfiled in the wrong folder, detailing a cash payment linked to a federal clerkship endorsement, I refused to ignore it. I also refused to ignore it when I came across a second one. I reported it to the Internal Ethics Committee, believing that was the moral route, believing justice meant speaking out. A few days later, my access to email was cut off. A professor who had previously complimented my appellate brief abruptly ignored me in passing. People began to murmur. The sympathetic glances started as well. After that, I received a phone call. The caller ID was blocked. A woman's voice greeted me. She spoke evenly and with authority. She explained that she was affiliated with the Federal Bureau of Legal Integrity and belonged to a task force monitoring select prestigious schools. My institution was among them. She remarked that someone like me, perceptive, disciplined, and unwavering, might prove useful, provided I was ready to disappear from one life and step into another. I made my choice quickly. 7 days later, I officially withdrew. There were no justifications given, no attempt to contest it. My mother wept as we spoke by phone. "Is it because you're pregnant?" she wondered. Just like that. It was the only plausible reason she could imagine for abandoning a future with so much potential. My father refused to speak to me for several weeks, and when he finally did, his only words were, "You made your choice." By the time Christmas rolled around, the story was fixed in everyone's mind. What nobody realized was that I was midway through my FBLI clearance process. I had already begun learning the techniques to trace digital funds through bogus corporations. My training was underway with operatives who used aliases and acted discreetly. To them, it looked as though I left because I lacked resilience. The truth is, I walked away because I spotted corruption, and someone entrusted me with a badge. Over the last 12 years, I have missed more Christmas gatherings than I have actually celebrated. I have mailed presents that show up without any acknowledgement. I replied to my mother's group texts with non-committal notes like, "Hope it's warm in Philadelphia," and slowly retreated from every family ritual. I once experienced love. I always managed to justify my absence. There was always a work emergency, a colleague's urgent issue, or a flight that was unexpectedly grounded. Eventually, my family stopped asking. At some point, my excuse slipped quietly into the background, settling like dust over neglected shelves. I was employed at a discreet, modest forensic consultancy, nothing flashy, not much influence, and above all, notable for being ordinary. My mother would give a resigned sigh over brunches with her friend Leona, but she has drifted away from her former self. We seldom discuss any of this in depth. My father, Arthur Ellington, whenever former co-workers pressed him about my current profession, would vaguely mention administrative research in private business and quickly redirect attention to my brother Carter's ever-expanding list of successes. All the while, I had committed 3 different aliases to memory, maintained 2 separate covert job identities, and found myself more frequently beneath the Francis K. Lowell Federal Courthouse than inside my own place. I had spoken with judges whose names were etched on the courthouse facade. I had traced wire transfers across 8 nations and exposed hidden bribery networks that nearly redirected political campaign money. There were times when I entered meetings incognito, armed with nothing but a notepad and a level of authorization that prompted security personnel to let me through without question. One Christmas Eve, I managed to return home in time for the evening meal. I dressed in a dark red sweater and forced a grin, trying to mask the exhaustion from spending the last 3 days debriefing a whistleblower, someone whose testimony would create tremors in a congressional subcommittee. After my brother Carter had his 3rd drink and soaked up compliments from our Uncle Timothy, he leaned over and gave me a sly grin. "At least I made it through the ethics bar exam," he said. Laughter erupted around the table, including from our father, Arthur. I chuckled quietly as I focused on spreading butter onto my bread, choosing to keep my silence. Just 2 days before that family meal, I sat behind mirrored glass, providing sworn testimony to a confidential federal oversight committee about judicial misconduct. The inquiry continued for 6 hours. My identity will never appear in the record. They assume my silence is a sign that I've surrendered. The reality, though, is that I remain quiet because the tasks I perform can't be disclosed. In fact, sometimes safeguarding the entire structure means accepting that those within it believe I'm insignificant. Judge Robert Malcolm used to pass out peppermint sticks to the local kids during my family's Christmas gatherings. I can still recall his loud, joyful laughter reverberating in our entryway, his hand always resting lightly on my father's shoulder, as if they were partners in a private contest. In those days, I imagined he resembled someone destined for a postage stamp. White-haired, with an assertive voice and a face that radiated assurance. Today, he is at the heart of Operation Sentinel Crest. Around 90 days ago, my team began unraveling hidden clues from a quietly dismissed audit connected to a lobbying agency in Virginia. Our investigation then pointed to Judge Robert Malcolm, with his wife's signature appearing on documents for a Bermuda shell company. Corporate quarterlies routed through unidentified entities, along with a property listing attached to a non-existent consultancy, had been identified. I traced it back. I established the connection. Then, a fortnight prior, I authorized the report for escalation. What truly caught me off guard was seeing his name listed for the formal ceremony at my brother Carter's induction. I had already sent my regrets. My intention was to keep working all weekend long, right up until the docket appeared in the internal system. His name was unmistakable. Judge Robert Malcolm, presiding in the primary role. I reported the matter to Director Eliza Rowan at our weekly Monday meeting. She looked up momentarily from the folder, her tone expressionless. "He'll probably spot you. If he's careful, he'll stay quiet. But there's a chance he won't." She didn't instruct me to stay away. That's never her approach. She always leaves us to determine our own risk tolerance. Yet just as she was shutting the file, she added, "You and I have spent a dozen years operating out of sight. Be sure I'm prepared when everything comes into view." With that, I made arrangements to fly to Philadelphia, used one of my old aliases to rent a car, and packed inconspicuous formal clothes, nothing that would attract attention or signal a federal connection. I committed Judge Robert Malcolm's distinctive habits under stress to memory. I went over his public appearances from the previous year. I considered every possible risk if I went forward. I pictured the mingling after court in the lobby. My preparation wasn't about the risk of being shamed in front of a crowd. Instead, I was bracing for a more personal form of humiliation. My father's eyes narrowing in suspicion, my mother grasping her wine glass a little too tightly. Carter stared at me as if I were a stranger. Judge Robert Malcolm was completely unaware I would be there. Meanwhile, my family didn't suspect that the man they were preparing to celebrate might be in handcuffs in half a year, and I would be the reason. Inside the courtroom, every bench was filled. Navy suits, strands of pearls, carefully shined shoes. Each family tried to present itself as if it belonged, as though the future awaiting their child depended on it. I opted for a plain black dress, pulled my hair back, and wore no makeup except for a bit of concealer to hide the exhaustion beneath my eyes. Nothing about my appearance suggested I worked for the Federal Bureau of Legal Integrity, which was exactly the intention. I kept my gaze lowered and my hands clasped, not as a sign of embarrassment, but as an act of self-control. My brother Carter sat in the first row, right next to our father, Arthur, who seemed barely able to contain how proud he was. My father kept fussing with his tie and murmured things to my brother Carter, likely courtroom humor or tips about commanding the room. My mother was dressed in her finest navy suit, her pearl necklace sparkling under the lights as she sat with perfect posture. From my seat, I could just make out the way my mother tilted her head back the slightest bit whenever someone complimented my brother Carter. Soon after, the sound of papers rustling filled the room as Judge Robert Malcolm made his way to the lectern. He appeared almost identical to the person I remembered from my childhood, with one exception. Now I finally understood the meaning behind that smile. He started his speech by congratulating us, the newly appointed lawyers, stressing the profound responsibility that comes with upholding legal ethics. I immediately recognized that he was operating on autopilot, giving the sort of address a man like him could recite without thinking. Yet, only 2 minutes in, his eyes wandered past the parents and the graduates seated in front, searching the crowd until they landed on me in the back. My heart tensed as his words faltered partway through a sentence. I noticed a brief flicker of puzzlement in his expression, quickly replaced by understanding. He paused just long enough for me to recognize the change. I lifted my chin slightly, a faint nod. It wasn't a challenge, just a quiet assertion of my presence. Rather than quickly recovering and moving on with the program, he caught both of us off guard. Clearing my throat, I gazed over the entire courtroom and announced, "Before we proceed, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge someone present today whose integrity changed the course of my career, though not in the way she may have intended." The room fell into a hush. I am Dr. Mara Ellington, Senior Investigator at the Federal Bureau of Legal Integrity. A heavy quiet descended instantly, complete and unbroken. People turned in their seats to look. My mother, Vivian Ellington, tensed, her neck growing stiff. My father, Arthur Ellington, went absolutely motionless. My brother Carter's posture shifted just a bit, as if he was making certain he'd heard correctly. Judge Robert Malcolm went on, his tone now steady and even. "Your work made me recall something I'd neglected, what it means to respect the law. I have you to thank for that." While I didn't lose my composure, the rest of the courtroom seemed to hold their breath. Even though most people in the room didn't grasp the point of his words, it didn't make any difference. Just hearing the title, Senior Investigator, FBLI, said everything that needed saying. For the first time since I'd grown up, my relatives saw me not as a problem to be managed, but as an unknown element that had slipped past them. Without so much as a grin or a nod, I remained perfectly still, relying on every instinct I had to observe the crowd and note every reaction. I had braced myself for all kinds of scenarios. I had anticipated many possibilities, but being noticed was not one of them. The reception was held in a side chamber next to the main lobby, where platters of catered snacks lined the tables and gentle applause filled the air. The normal hum of workplace banter and family joy had been replaced by an uneasy hush, as if everyone was waiting for me to speak up. I kept to the rear of the room, holding a glass of ginger ale I hadn't touched, my face set in the placid composure that had supported me through surveillance assignments, field questioning, and locked-door debriefings. Yet this wasn't the procedure of a federal court. This was family. And there was no handbook for handling things when my father looked at me as if I'd emerged from a confidential dossier. My father was the one who finally shattered the awkward stillness. He turned away from the dessert spread, his quiet voice nonetheless resonating through the room. "FBLI, since when?" he asked, and when my gaze met his, I realized there was no use dodging the question. "Since Danford." It was during the ethics inquiry that I was approached. I never left. I was selected. His forehead creased and his jaw clenched, as if he was rethinking all his beliefs from the past. My mother stayed silent at first, her fingers shaking while she fiddled with her bracelet, and her lips parted just a bit. After a moment, she quietly said, "We believed you were gone." I replied, "I was doing the work I'd been trained and authorized for." Nobody spoke for several moments. Next, my brother Carter moved in closer. Whatever law school arrogance he'd had was replaced by a different look, maybe intrigue, possibly even admiration. That incident with the prosecutor's office last year, those confidential indictments, my group was behind that, right? I chose not to give a straightforward response. The attorney on that prosecution had been noticed by our branch 2 years before. All I'll say is, you didn't make those arguments alone. His eyes grew bigger as he leaned away, as if the world beneath him had tipped. My father, Arthur Ellington, exhaled deeply in the same manner he once did, before presenting his closing statements. So all this time we assumed you'd let go, but actually you were conducting undercover investigations into federal corruption, he said. That's both my actual work and the story everyone's supposed to believe, I explained. He asked, is that all standard procedure? Keeping the exposure low so it's safer for everyone? My mother replied with a tremor in her voice. Do you have any idea how many nights I stayed up worrying that you didn't even know who you really were? I always knew exactly who I was, I answered softly. You just weren't allowed to know. There was no applause or tears from anyone. But for the first time in so many years, nobody was looking through me or past me. And honestly, that was more than I could have wanted. Later that night, as the number of guests dwindled and the courteous goodbyes turned into drawn-out, shocked pauses, I ended up returning to my parents' house. The rooms felt tinier than my memory painted them. The furniture was still recognizable, but the colors on the walls had dulled. They hadn't changed, yet somehow everything felt even more delicate now that something had shifted in the way we related to each other. My mother slipped upstairs without saying anything for several minutes. When she came back, her footsteps were nearly silent on the rug. She was holding a cardboard box, its seams taped and the surface yellowed from age. My mother placed it on the coffee table in front of where I sat, then knelt down next to it, smoothing her palm over the top before carefully lifting the lid. I held on to these, she whispered. I'm not sure why. I just couldn't bring myself to toss them. Inside was my old Danford College of Law ID badge, its corners showing wear. There was also a battered file with my name on it, still sealed with commendations inside. I flipped it open to discover several early letters from professors, acknowledging praise that I'd never mentioned, and notes about possible judicial clerk positions that I hadn't pursued. And hidden under everything else was a slim manila envelope. This arrived last year, my mother said. There was no sender's address. I accepted the envelope and gingerly extracted what was inside. Enclosed was a single-page FBLI certificate, deliberately ambiguous, offering little detail, simply stating at the bottom that I was recognized for service in upholding national integrity and protecting judicial processes. It didn't serve as the kind of conclusive evidence people used to demand, lacking a clear role or time frame, but its authenticity was unquestionable, and it now belonged to us. My father kept quiet, positioned near the hearth with his hands folded behind his back. When my eyes met his, I noticed him fixating on the envelope as though it contained long-awaited, once-classified revelations. You were a guardian for people like me, he eventually murmured. My father's voice was steady, but I noticed a gentler undertone that hadn't been there before. Yet I let you down. I said nothing, and my silence confirmed I had nothing to add. Arthur moved closer by one pace, then another, finally reaching out. Not as my father this time, but as a person who truly understood what it meant to contribute to a purpose greater than myself. Thank you, Dr. Mara Ellington. I shook her hand, and for the first time in ages, I had the sense that I was actually being recognized for who I was. The backyard retained its familiar scents, freshly mown grass, the smoky aroma of charcoal, and that sharp lighter fluid smell that my father stubbornly used, even after countless offers from my brother Carter to modernize the grill. It was Independence Day, and as always, my family played host. Folding chairs hugged the perimeter of the yard, while napkins patterned with flags fluttered next to stacks of paper plates. The gathering consisted of neighbors, close friends of the family, and a handful of my father's longtime co-workers, gentlemen with silver at their temples who began their anecdotes with, "Back in my courtroom days." For once I made it on time. I didn't linger by the curb or wait for some message to encourage me inside. I came through the side gate with a homemade berry crumble in my arms, and I didn't even blink when my father noticed me from across the lawn. He stood up straight, not tense like old times, but radiating pride. When I made my way to the grill, my father turned to address the small group of retired attorneys around him and said, "Gentlemen, this is my daughter, Dr. Mara Ellington, FBLI." There wasn't a hint of uncertainty in his tone. It was just the truth. It was a straightforward introduction, but it carried a certain significance that only people of our kind would recognize. No one followed up with questions, just a handful of respectful nods, and that sufficed. My brother Carter caught up with me by the cooler a short time later, both hands full with 2 heaping plates. He handed me one, flashing a wide grin. "So, you're the one who made the prosecutor's office scramble before everything shut down?" I arched an eyebrow while accepting the plate. I couldn't confirm or deny that. Carter chuckled. We fell silent after that. Nothing else needed to be said. The sky was tinged with pink when someone set off the first sparkler. I realized then that I was no longer at the edge of the gathering. I was finally at its heart, in my own way. For a long time, I allowed the Ellingtons to think I had abandoned every goal I used to hold dear. I let family dinners pass with my name mentioned only in passing. They spoke of me in gentle voices, as if I were a story that had not yet reached its intended ending. That hush was something I cloaked myself in, not because I was indifferent, but because the work I did demanded it, because seeking justice often doesn't involve courtly attire or grand speeches. At times, justice is a silent observer seated at the rear of a courtroom. Other times, it operates behind aliases, protected information, and confidential meetings. Occasionally, truth looks like defeat until it finally gets its chance. My intention was never to prove myself to them by appearing. I was present because that particular moment mattered to my brother, Carter. I arrived because I believe the selves we build in quiet moments are worthy of being seen as well. And because in families such as mine, grounded in tradition and often oblivious to complexity, honesty can ultimately find its place. So, if your family has ever misunderstood you or made assumptions without truly knowing you, don't waste your energy trying to change their opinions. Live authentically and allow time to reveal what's truly important. Eventually, truth stops murmuring. It rises and demands to be recognized.